Have you been feeling too productive lately? Well, you should try the man flu, guaranteed to drop your productivity by 95% for at least 3 days, plus it's gonna turn you into a crybaby that your wife will absolutely hate, and bonus if you're self-employed because you don't get any sick days. Yes, I have been very sick for the past week. Yeah, you can hear it. Voice terrible, look even worse than usual. Anyway, let's move on to the Linux news. We've got Linux allegedly passing the 10% market share mark, although this number is disputable, so we'll talk about it. The trend in general is still pretty positive. We also have AI model hijacking, let's call it, which is going to be the new SEO, which everybody hated now, and now you're gonna hate LLM hijacking even more. And we also have plenty of other really cool Linux and open source news, and we also have this message from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by SquareSpace. You've seen them all over the internet, and you probably already know that they're your all-in-one platform to create, to manage, to deploy, and to build your own website. They offer an entire suite of easy-to-use tools to make sure that your website not only looks good, does the things you want it to do just in a few clicks, but also ranks well, and they give you all the tools to manage that website after that. So of course, to create the website, you have the website builder, you've got plenty of templates for all types of websites, and then you have pre-built page layouts to create pages in an instant instead of designing each one by one. Although if you want to do that, you can, because you can reorder elements on screen, change the colors, the fonts, and everything. And it is not just for small websites either. Squarespace handles multiple contributors with permissions that let you manage each user's access to each feature, from comment moderation all the way to analytics and billing information. And to make sure that you stay in control anywhere and over time, Squarespace has a mobile app for Android and iOS that gives you notifications for sales on your online store. It lets you manage payments and inventory. It lets you view all the metrics that you need to see where your website is going and how it is doing. So check out squarespace.com/theLinuxExperiment. The link is down in the description, of course. You'll get a 14 days free trial, and once we are ready to get started, you'll get a 10% off discount for your first purchase of a domain name or a website. So, according to StatCounter, Linux has passed the 10% market share in North America. Now, these numbers aren't an exact figure, it's StatCounter, we already talked about how they manage those numbers. It's basically web page visits aggregated by operating system and by region. What matters here is the progression of Linux, and this is a huge jump. So they recently also reattributed their unknown category, which we didn't really know what was in there. Apparently they found a way to attribute those visits to specific operating systems, and this resulted in Linux reaching a bit above 10% in North America, Windows sitting at 57%, and macOS, all versions combined, at about 30%. If you look at things worldwide, so not just North America, Linux sits at 7.5%, which is still pretty neat. As usual, this is more a reflection on the way things are measured than the actual fixed number of where we're sitting right now, but the trend measured here is pretty good. Now, there is some dispute around those numbers. A more Windows-focused website seems to think that this market share is not correct. What they point out to is that first, StatCounter does not track users, individual visits. It tracks pages. It's not unique visitors, it is page views, which works for measuring how popular a website is or how much each operating system's users browse the web. But it doesn't measure market share properly because you could have one person visiting millions of web pages, and that person would, for example, be a crawler or an AI bot. Those are mostly running on Linux. They could load millions of web pages and, of course, artificially inflate the market share of Linux in StatCounter. So that website cross-referenced the data with Cloudflare Radar, which shows activity from bots and from humans, and of course the market share data seems to be biased by bots using Linux. If you filter for human traffic, it keeps Linux at 4.5 to 5%, and when you include all of those bots, you get up to 16%, sometimes 26% Linux market share in certain peaks. Another source entirely, the stats from the US government websites, shows Linux growing significantly though, at 6.8% of all traffic, including mobile operating systems. So, of course, all in all, it doesn't really matter. A huge jump like this is likely due to a difference in the way things are counted. What matters is the upwards trend. And if this trend was only made up of AI bots, we would have seen Linux market share jump higher significantly earlier than this, because all AI bot crawlers run on Linux, and even all SEO bots, all bots from search engines, tend to run on Linux servers. So if those were aggregated, we would have seen this curve being extremely high way earlier than it is right now. There might be some bot traffic in there because we all know the web is now mostly visited by bots, but still, what matters here is the trend and the progression, and that trend clearly shows that Linux is growing quite fast, while Windows is dropping equally as fast, and macOS basically grows a little bit as well. This is important. Microsoft is shooting itself in the foot again and again with Windows, with its updates, with the features that they push, and if they keep doing so, we're gonna keep growing, because people just don't want to deal with that crap. Even if there are bots in that upwards curve, there are also some very, very real users, and Linux keeps growing, which is all in all pretty good. The number itself, 10%, doesn't really matter. What matters is we're growing still. Now, if you hated all the weird techniques and manipulations that resulted in a website getting better SEO, you're gonna hate those trends too, because there are two more that will make the internet way worse. The first one is websites serving ads to AI chatbots that only those AI crawler bots can see. Time Magazine, for example, highlighted the practice. Their goal is, let's influence ChatGPT with ads, and then we can influence all their users because the content of the ad will be used to train the model. If you serve an ad to just one person, you influence one person. If you serve an ad to the crawler bot that also gathers content to train the actual ChatGPT chatbot, then you're influencing all of ChatGPT users. So now they're giving ads only to these crawlers as embedded content in certain web pages that users cannot see, cannot access, but AI bots still crawl. This feeds a bunch of facts, as they call them, for example, for an online bank, so the chatbot can then use these facts to recommend said bank to its own users. That page is apparently presented as an FAQ with pre-made questions and answers, questions in the form that users might type in a chatbot if they're looking for help. Now, this first trend is already pretty worrying because as chatbots are pretty dumb and they gobble up everything online, they will gobble up this data as well. Between now and the time chatbots realize they shouldn't crawl this, they will already have ingested all of that data and all of those ads, and it's gonna turn into a game of cat and mouse with websites and publishers and ad networks finding new ways to make sure that their ads are crawled and trained on by the bots, and AI manufacturers or developers are trying to make sure that those pages are ignored, because I don't think they're gonna want that in their dataset, but who knows, they take anything. And at the opposite end of that spectrum, there's the poison AI movement, which aims to feed bad information to AI models with corrupted content, misleading data, and false information to make the tools less useful and to turn people away from them. This might also incentivize AI makers to avoid crawling certain websites if these are known to poison their datasets. Hopefully, they would only put that misleading info in pages only accessible to crawlers and not to users, because then they might as well just have poisoned their entire website. And of course, here again, this will have dire consequences because anyone who still uses models that are poisoned with that false data will get more false information than they already get using those chatbots, on top of getting recommendations based on ads that the bot doesn't even know are ads. So this is probably going to be the new SEO going forward, optimizing your website and even your ads to try and feed them onto the model so they can train on that and give your answers to users, maybe put your website in the sources links and all of that stuff. I already kind of despised SEO work previously because it did not result in better content for users. It resulted in optimized websites with plenty of redundancies and plenty of useless paragraphs. And now it's gonna be pretty much worse. And the idea of poisoning an LLM by feeding it false data is pretty fun in theory, but in practice, it's gonna take time for people to realize that the data they're using is so wrong that they want to stop using AI. And in the meantime, you will just have a few years of pure chaos and misinformation everywhere, which I don't think is the right solution. As usual, my advice will be do not use AI for complex web searches. It's just not good at it. For simple tidbits of information, sure, but for actual, factual, high-stakes searches, AI is not good at it, and it's going to get worse with these two trends, so yeah, just not a good tool to use. Now, on to some more good news. KDE is going to fix a bunch of stuff that will make people's lives much easier. So first is a nice performance boost for hybrid laptops or multi-GPU systems. Xavier Hugel, who is a prominent Kwin developer, implemented DMA Buff v6. This will let Kwin manage multi-GPU copies of what's being rendered, meaning what your discrete GPU is rendering no longer needs to go through the RAM, through the CPU, to actually appear on a display on your laptop or an external display connected to your integrated GPU. This will massively improve performance. For example, testing Cyberpunk 2077, he went from 27 to 50 FPS on his system. And the general frame rate improved from 40 FPS to 120 FPS when using an external GPU. So the main issue with all of this on Linux, it has been the same for a long while. If you start an application or a game that uses the discrete GPU, then that GPU renders everything. It creates a buffer to store the information. But that buffer is passed to the compositor. The compositor passes that buffer to the integrated GPU, which is the main one that runs your system and, for example, your laptop's display, and that goes through the RAM, which of course is not as efficient as video RAM to do video content. And it got even worse if your display was plugged into your discrete GPU through HDMI, for example, because then you still have the discrete GPU creating the buffer, that buffer being passed to the compositor passing it to your main GPU, which generally is the integrated one, and then that buffer being resent to the discrete GPU to then be displayed on the screen. So in Plasma 6.8, this will be fixed after 2 years of work. This should also be implemented in Mesa. Nvidia also has a proposed implementation. There are some remaining caveats. Kwin's compositing happens on the main GPU, so generally it's going to be the integrated one, which means there is still a bottleneck unless the application or the game uses direct scan-out when being displayed in full screen. This also will not work well for Wayland right now because X11 is not really capable of understanding all of this. It doesn't really have a concept of separated GPUs, separated displays. It was never designed for any of that. This means the benefits of these changes, for gaming at least, will be there for games that run natively on Linux or when using the Wayland backend of Proton and Wine. That is pretty awesome work. This is something that has affected me ever since I started using Linux. I really wanted to do a single USB-C cable setup where I plugged my external monitor into my laptop. This would have charged my laptop, used the external display, and also made the external display act as a USB hub, which would have been insanely useful because you can just use one single cable. That's what you can do on Windows and on macOS. On Linux, it never really worked properly because you got absolutely abysmal performance in games and in programs that require the GPU, like, for example, DaVinci Resolve or any editing software. Fixing that is awesome. And the second thing that KDE is gonna fix is gamma control for Wayland. Yes, KDE and even GNOME can already do color management nowadays, which should make simple gamma adjustments non-necessary because you can have a full-on color profiles. But some people just want to adjust the gamma for their display and maybe even the RGB values without touching color profile files, ICC color profiles, and all of that stuff. So on KDE, they're now releasing K-Gamma, which just edits the ICC profile itself with 4 sliders that you can control, one for the gamma, one for each RGB color. You can apply those settings to each monitor individually as well. It stores the changes in an ICC file, and that's loaded straight into the GPU's lookup tables, which means it will apply every time you boot up your computer. There will be no weird flickering as the compositor fetches an additional setting. This existed on X11 too, but the Wayland version is admittedly better because it supports independent values for each monitor, so you can set values for each display. It also works with Nightlight, and it is applied by Kwin on startup. This app will be shipped as a Flatpak at some point to stay independent from Plasma, so it doesn't really become a dependency on the desktop itself. Now that doesn't solve the issue for other desktops, but for Plasma at least, it means you have an easier way to just control the gamma values or the RGB values if your color calibration isn't fantastic. This is probably something that should be in the main system settings of Plasma. It feels like they solve the problem in the most complex way, basically saying, hey, people want to tweak certain values and color calibration of their displays. Okay, let's implement full-on color profile support, except for most people, that's not what they want. They just wanted a simple slider because color profiles are just way too complex and technical for what they actually wanted to do. That slider should probably be in the display settings of KDE instead of a separate app, I think. Now we have some indication that the Steam frame might not be too far away because Valve made FEX and Lepton public on Steam. These are the tools that will let the Steam frame play games properly because it is reliant on an ARM CPU, thus it needs a translation layer from x86 to ARM, that is FEX, FEX. And they also added a way to play Android games, that is through Lepton. It seems to be a container that runs Android. Probably it's just Waydroid with a few tweaks. Of course, these tools will likely also help any ARM device that you'd want to play games on, for example, an Apple Silicon Mac that is well supported with Asahi. They also added a Steam Frame ARM64 compatibility list that shows a few games that rely on Proton ARM64, so a specific build of Proton for ARM. Now, from what I understand, Lepton will basically just be used for games that are made for Android but have been uploaded and listed as available games on Steam, but as with Proton, I think Lepton will just be usable outside of Steam and might be used to run Android apps and games on any ARM device, which would be pretty neat, or maybe even x86 devices. That would be pretty fantastic to see. I'm waiting to see what they added, because it seems to be based on Waydroid. I want to see what they fixed or improved compared to Waydroid. That could be pretty cool. Now, the Linux kernel keeps defining more policies on what they accept in terms of AI-generated patches, and it seems like the staging area of the kernel at least will not accept any AI-generated patch, except for ones that fix glaring security issues. So Greg Coher-Hartman announced that new policy. It specifically targets the drivers/staging area of the kernel. This is meant for developers to have a space to learn how to get involved with the Linux kernel. They voluntarily leave a bunch of code reformatting tasks, small bugs that don't have a significant impact, all of that stuff as low-hanging fruits that new beginner developers or beginner contributors could tackle and address. Stuff like cleaning up the code base, adopting a more Linux kernel friendly coding style, moving to newer API versions, that kind of stuff. It's a place where there is no pressure for developers because no one will use that code until it is moved to the actual kernel, which might not happen if this is not satisfactory. This is an area where LLMs have been used way too much, apparently, generating a ton of patches that fix coding styles and do these small tasks, which fully defeats the purpose because it's meant to let people learn how to code and how to contribute. As a result, any patch that is LLM generated for that staging area will be rejected, except for the case where that patch fixes an actual security problem. This comes with a few guidelines. The security issue must have been tested on the actual hardware that the driver manages, and that test must be described, so there must be human involvement still. As Greg Coher-Hartman puts it, a third of the results generated by LLMs are wrong or sometimes even harmful. And he also says that it is very apparent when something is AI generated, and so trying to trick a maintainer by not disclosing the use of AI when submitting an LLM generated patch will have consequences because they can very much tell that AI has been used. And that feels like a normal, fine policy if the goal of this staging area is to let people learn how to code, adopt the right coding style, learn how Linux kernel contributions are managed. Then using an LLM to fix those issues is useless. That's not what this place is for. You might as well just shut it down and not touch it. So refusing LLM contributions feels normal here. Good news for LVFS, the Linux vendor firmware service. Nvidia is now a sponsor of them at the premier tier, meaning they contribute $100,000 a year in funding. That is pretty cool for the project because in the span of a few months, they got support from Dell, HP, Lenovo, and now Nvidia, which basically means they have at least
$400,000 yearly to run the service. I don't know if that's enough to fund everything, the work, the development, the infrastructure, but it is a sizable sum anyway, and it's apparently the funding target that they set for themselves, so chances are that is enough to keep things running smoothly. And of course, Nvidia is also distributing firmware through LVFS, although not every piece of hardware that they sell is handled through that service. Now, it is pretty cool stuff, and it's good to see those projects getting funding from the companies that benefit from them, because it's not just sponsoring them out of the goodness of their hearts. For Nvidia, being able to distribute firmware very easily to their clients on Linux, which is a lot of their clients, it's a very valuable service. It means that they can deliver firmware updates, security fixes reliably to every one of their customers. This reduces support, this reduces developer time, this reduces weird tooling that you might need to push on those updates in another way. It's very useful for them. And of course, for Nvidia, $100,000 isn't much, but they just followed the tier structure of LVFS and they picked the highest one. So I think that's good. Now, this week, Bottles also got a very solid new update. If you don't know about Bottles, and yes, I pronounce it even more weirdly when I'm sick, so yes, you'll probably make jokes in the comments as usual. It's an easy graphical way of running Windows applications through Wine and Proton. It's all isolated in their own bottles or virtual Windows environments and C drives. They also updated Soda, which is their own version of Wine. It now supports a Vulkan layer that allows for lossless scaling and frame generation in games that supports it. Bottles also added a frame rate limiter for games, their support for D7VK, which is DXVK for DirectX 7 games. There's also the groundwork for supporting FSR4 through Proton as well. HDR is better supported too. You can run applications using GameScope in windowed mode. Bottles can detect various Proton versions that you're using through Steam, and you can also list your installed Steam games in Bottles and add them to your library, meaning if you have any wine tricks and tweaks and changes to apply to these games' prefixes and environments, it's much easier to do so by using the Bottles GUI. They also let you add custom covers for games and applications. You can back up entire bottles or just the program data for apps stored in there. You can set file associations for your actual files on Linux to an application installed through Bottles. Bottles can also share USB devices and input devices to the application it runs, even through the sandbox, and there are plenty of bug fixes and improvements to the UI too. It also can now detect NT-Sync in your kernel if you have that, so it can improve performance. It can use NVK as a driver. Basically, it is a massive update with the recommended method for install still being the Flatpak. That's the thing that they support. Now, if you ever need to run an isolated EXE or MSI program, if you have games on disks, all the titles, or if you have games digitally that don't really run through Steam, but you have the executables and the installers, using Bottles to get them to run is actually probably your best solution. It's very easy to use, it is very customizable, very configurable, and it is a nice graphical user interface to handle Windows programs on Linux. It's just going to work much better than installing Wine on your system and double-clicking the executable. You will have a lot more control, you will have actual logs of what's happening. It's just a good solution. Now let's go back to KDE a little bit, because their Union style engine is making good progress. This will be the heart of theming for KDE applications. Basically, it is a single entry point for theming all KDE applications, no matter if they rely on Qt widgets, pure Qt, Qt Quick, Kirigami, or whatever other framework you can use to develop KDE applications. Currently, this requires a lot of work from the developers of the Breeze theme, because they basically have to make a theme for every framework that can be used, and it also means that if you use something like Quantum or another theme than Breeze, plenty of KDE apps will not be themed properly because they just don't have the support for all of those frameworks. Union is meant to fix all of this. It made its debut in Plasma 6.7, but it only worked on Qt Quick applications. It is, of course, also early days, so bug reports have already been received and addressed. Things are not perfect in 6.7. Long term, though, Union won't just be a theme in the appearance settings. It will have its own settings page that lets you pick what look you want to apply through Union. Because remember, Union isn't the theme, it's not like Breeze. It's the engine that themes the applications. Of course, that was a lot of work, but they already have a first iteration of that settings page that doesn't look much different than the application style page, but in time it will evolve to be better. For Qt widgets applications, stuff like Dolphin for example, KDevelop and others, there's a style being built for Union, so these applications can be themed by the engine too. It is very early days, but apparently it works well enough already on Dolphin and other test applications. Developers are trying to push this for 6.8, but if it's not ready, it will be delayed to the next release or the one after that. It comes out when it's ready. Interestingly, Oxygen could also be ported to Union, which is the other KDE theme that you might remember from the KDE 4 days. And what's cool is that Oxygen, if it's supported by Union or if it has a Union style, it could work on more applications than it is currently able to handle. Because that's an old theme, it doesn't work well with certain apps built with Qt Quick, Kirigami and others, because it never was meant to support those. If it had a Union style, it would then be able to theme all of those. All in all, it is a cool project. It is the return of the theme engine that can handle any KDE application, and who knows, maybe at some point a crazy bastard will implement a Union style for GTK and libadwaita, and then we'll have another big fat war on our hands for people theming stuff that they shouldn't theme, maybe, who knows. Yeah, we'll talk about this if this ever happens, but I'm sure this will be very controversial if it does. And to conclude, we have another nasty vulnerability that affects most Linux systems. This time it lives in KVM. The flaw is dubbed Zapscape and it dates back from 2020. It lets virtualized guests escape to the host that runs those VMs and run commands as root on the host, which obviously is really bad. This only affects x86 guests and hosts, but that is most systems. If you got a kernel update on July 21st or later, you're good, but if not, you need to update that kernel quickly. So the flaw could let attackers, for example, rent a single VM on a public cloud provider and use it to take down every single other VM that is running on the same physical server, or just infect them all by escaping to the host. So the potential for damage isn't really your local VM that you use to test a window manager or a distro. It is more for cloud providers and managed system providers. That exploit is apparently easier on Red Hat-based distros because their /dev/kvm is writable, so an unprivileged user could become root directly without having to gain root privileges on the VM first. In other environments where root is disabled on the VM or that are not using Red Hat, you already need a local privilege escalation to gain root in the VM, and then you use that root access to escape the VM and move on to the host. So that's a bit trickier, but it's still doable. That's a pretty nasty one this time because it could affect a lot of cloud providers that provide a shared infrastructure where you just rent a VM on a physical server. Even if your VM is really well secured, if the host isn't, then your VM is only as secure as the host is. So that's not fantastic. What is fantastic though is our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. So Tuxedo is based in Germany, but they ship their laptops and desktops to most countries in the world. Those devices come with Linux pre-installed. So you can get your own hardware. So you can get some pretty neat hardware that supports Linux really well. They actually contribute drivers upstream to make sure that their stuff runs Linux fantastically. They have a big range of devices. You can get a more affordable, smaller form factor laptop, all the way up to a workstation, a gaming laptop, you name it. You have a lot of agency on the hardware that you want inside of your device. And of course, you can also pick the keyboard layout, the logo that you want engraved on the device, or no logo at all if you don't like branding. They are fantastic. I've only been using Tuxedo Computers to do everything that you see on this channel for the past 3 or 4 years now, and they've been a fantastic support for the channel. So thanks Tuxedo for sponsoring, and if you want to check out their devices, the link is down in the description. Anyway, this will conclude today's video. My throat and voice are dying anyways, so I guess I'll leave you with this. Click all the YouTube links and buttons and whatever else. You have plenty of links to support the show down there. It's always very important. You know why that is. Thank you all for watching, and I guess you'll hear me in the next one next week. Bye!